Be read a second time. I call the member for Monaro.
Mr. Acting Speaker, I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this bill today, as with previous members, I acknowledge the member for Murray for introducing the bill and her long commitment to these issues. I listened to the opposition with interest on the bill, and I'll be interested to see the amendments they're proposing. And I don't doubt the genuine nature of the comments, but I have to say that over the years that I've been observing the Basin Plan, I find a number of the opposition's positions on this a little contradictory at times, and I suspect that in many respects the member for Murray is in this place because many people in her community didn't see the Nationals and the Liberals as actually providing consistent positions on much of this over the last decade or so at all, and felt that they wanted someone who, much as I sometimes disagree with the member for Murray, always has a very clear view on these issues and makes it very clear to her community. Now, I have a bit of a history in this water space. I was for 4 years the CEO of the National Irrigators Council, and for 2 years after that, and before being selected to come back into this place, was on the board of Murrumbidgee Irrigation as an independent board member. Obviously, so I come into this place with quite a long history of involvement in the Basin Plan and some of the challenges. And I want to start out some of my comments by pointing out that we do see a lot in the media about the failure of the Basin Plan. And I want to be really clear about this. In large parts, the Basin Plan has already succeeded in obtaining the water that it was originally scheduled to get for the environment. In fact, it has already achieved 98% of the surface water and 92% of the groundwater against the original Bridging the Gaps target. So, with apologies to those who know the plan in detail, I do want to just go through some of the basics for people who might be watching or reading this later on. There's a number of different components to the Basin Plan, and it's a very complex plan. Originally, a target of 2,750 gigalitres of water was the original target that was set to be obtained. Now, that came out of the Basin Plan in 2012. Prior to that, we had seen a lot of buyback occur, which was pretty well untargeted, and that did lead to some significant negative socio-economic impacts because at that stage of the planning for the plan, there really wasn't good enough methods in place to deal with socio-economic impact. And indeed, I think most people who've watched the plan over the years would agree that the structural adjustment assistance, such as it was provided to regional communities, was really quite poor and often poorly directed. And if there is ever to be buybacks by the federal government, then it really does need to be accompanied by structural adjustment work with regional communities, which builds on where regional communities feel they should be in the future, and ensures that they have a say and a long-term focus on job and not just photo opportunity check handovers to local groups that don't employ people, which is often what happened in the past, quite frankly. But there is a number of components to the Basin Plan. There's a lot of focus at the moment on the 450 gigalitres of upwater. The upwater component of the plan is part of the Sustainable Diversion Limit Adjustment mechanism, which was in the original plan. It was put there because South Australia wasn't happy with the 2750 original target. And frankly, at the time, it was sold to South Australia as being something which would be achieved. To those of us in New South Wales, and I was the Agriculture Minister for part of this negotiation period leading up to it, it was sold to us as an upper target and not necessarily a target that has to be achieved. Now, we've seen a fair bit of discussion over the years since, which has served to set that as being a non-negotiable for a lot of people. And it's certainly the case that the federal government sees it as that at the moment. But this is not new news that we are not within any striking distance at all of achieving the targets in 2024, which are originally set to be achieved. In fact, when I was CEO of the National Irrigators Council, in the submissions that I wrote for the organisation, pointed this out many times to things like for the Water for the Environment Special Account Review, to the Productivity Commission reviews of the Basin Plan to say that we needed to take action. And the fundamental reason why we are nowhere near achieving those targets is because the previous New South Wales government, the previous Victorian government, and some of the Commonwealth governments over the times basically just kept pushing things out to the never-never, but they failed to actually take on some of the serious targets of achieving the Sustainable Diversion Limit Adjustment Mechanisms, supply and constraint measures, and efficiency measures. And those are the things which we need more time for. So the critical thing that's happened in the last couple of days is that the Commonwealth Government has agreed that the timeframes need to be extended to achieve some of these things. And I don't think many people, other than those who just wish the Basin Plan would go away, and I acknowledge there is people out there in the community who think that, but that's not a realistic thing to think. The Basin Plan is here to stay, and as many of those submissions I mentioned before pointed out, it has always been a danger that if we weren't able to achieve the Basin Plan targets and the 450 gigalitres through the efficiency mechanisms or other things which achieve the outcomes, and I'd like to come back to that, then we would have a government at some point in the future coming back and saying it wanted to buy back that water. And the member for Murray is absolutely right in her second reading speech. Right now, it is against the law for the 450 gigalitres to be recovered through buybacks. It requires a change to the legislation in the federal parliament for them to be able to do that. So when the opposition talks about the 2018 Ministerial Committee agreement around protecting communities and around socioeconomic impacts, that was actually about the efficiency measure projects which had to have that test applied to them. And unfortunately what it did is it stopped most of the efficiency measures projects from being proposed. In fact, we had areas like the area around the Murray-Goulburn in Victoria who basically said we don't want a bar of on-farm efficiency projects. Now, I think if we think about and look at areas which have been reasonably successful through this task, and with all due respect to my former board colleagues, including the member for Murray's partner who has had a long involvement in Murrumbidgee irrigation as well, I think that Griffith area is one of the areas where we've seen farmers most readily adapt those efficiency projects and make their operations future-proof, assuming that they don't lose all the water from their allocations in the long term. And that is something which is really important. It's important for government to be taking on additional time and encouraging those efficiency projects which can help us to meet the Basin Plan objectives. It's also absolutely vital that we see government seriously address the supply and constraint measures, because that's another aspect of the Basin Plan which, if we don't, we have a target there which we can achieve, which is colloquially known as downwater, of 605 gigalitres, and that's an amount which has been taken off that 2750 gigalitres of the original closing the gap, meeting the gap, bridge the gap, measures, and that's an amount which has to be actually met or met by supply and constraint measures and have those assessed as being equal to that amount of water. And right now in the Commonwealth legislation, if that's not met by 2024, we could see the Commonwealth go in and undertake buybacks to achieve that, and there is nothing to stop them from doing that. They can also, as they've already announced, go into buybacks untargeted by, or our targeted, I guess, to the rivers to meet the bridge the gap which is still there. So there is several components of this which it's not as simple as just saying, well, let's stop any buybacks from occurring in the long term. The government and the Premier, again at question time today, made it absolutely clear that the New South Wales government does not want to see untargeted buybacks, does not want to see buybacks, because we recognise the impact on communities and on food supply. And, for instance, 84% of our fruit and our vegetables come from irrigators. 84%. That's not something you can just replace through some other mechanism unless you want to bring them in tins from overseas. And I don't think any of us want to see that. So we need to be working much more constructively than we saw from the previous government in this area on actually achieving, and could I seek an extension of time?
The member seeks an extension of time. All those in favour, please say aye. Those against? Okay. Extension granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We do need to see the effort to actually meet the 605 gigalitres of the supply and constraint measures from the Sustainable Diversion Limit Adjustment Mechanism, and some of that is really vital constraint measures, and they're controversial. They're controversial for people because, in layman's terms, they basically are about getting permission to flood people with man-made floods over various periods of time. But right now, the constraint measures are absolutely vital, because even if you had all the water which the basin plan, including the 450, put in place, you couldn't deliver it because you don't have the capacity in the rivers to deliver that downstream. And so those constraint measures were a prerequisite measure in the basin plan, and they're also part of the 605 gigalitres supply and constraint measures. They must be given higher priority by government, otherwise we do risk buyback occurring in valleys, including in the southern basin. And the southern basin valleys have met all their targets to date, met every target to date. And they need to be given the assurance that they won't pay the price because of governments failing to deliver their priorities. And that really, to me, is one of the fundamental problems with the way some of the basin plan work has gone over the last decade. We have a responsibility which is separated from the cost. The responsibility to deliver these measures with government. And frankly, the last government in New South Wales failed to take action on that. The coalition government, when they were in Canberra, in the federal level, failed to act on many of these things. And frankly, the Labor government in Victoria doesn't want to act on these things and seems to think that they can push all this out to the never-never as well. So I'm critical of that as well. But the price for that failure is paid by communities and irrigators, and that's simply not fair, because they are not, in most cases, the ones who are holding up the work on these supply and constraints measures. We need a government which is committed to that, but right now in 2023, we all know it's impossible to achieve those by 2024. So the timeframes need to go out, and that aspect of the federal government's announcement in the last few days, I think, should be welcomed. We need to see the efficiency measures worked on. Again, one of the biggest projects in New South Wales is work that's being undertaken right now by Murrumbidgee Irrigation, which is going to save a significant amount of water and is going to be to return it to the environment. We hear a lot from South Australia about these things. When you have a look at their contribution to the 450, it is negligible. And so when you think about the fact that these 450 gigalitres that we hear a lot about and the efficiency measures work is all designed to achieve what are called Schedule 5 outcomes in the basin plan. And those are largely environmental outcomes designed to benefit rivers in South Australia. So it is absolutely critical in a lot of cases that the water, you simply won't achieve those outcomes, for instance, by making a large water saving around Dubbo, because only 7% of that water ever gets down the Darling River, and it won't help to achieve the Schedule 5 outcomes. So I think it would be sensible for governments in talking about these things not to get fixated, as the media does all the time, on the number of gigalitres in the basin plan, but also to come back and have a look at the outcomes that we're trying to achieve from the basin plan. Where are the wetlands we're trying to keep alive? They're not all in South Australia. They're not all in at the mouth of the Murray. Many of them are in Victoria and New South Wales, and we need to be looking at how we achieve the outcomes for those areas of our environment and our river system. We need to look at because if we ended up with 3,200 gigalitres of additional water in the river, and let's remember we've already taken 1 in 5 litres that used to be available for irrigation out of the system to achieve what are already some really positive environmental outcomes, and I think that needs to be acknowledged as well. But if we had all that water flowing down the river, you wouldn't necessarily have more native fish, because you've got to have water coming out at the right temperature. You've got to make sure there's not barriers for native fish passage. There's a range of complementary measures. You've got to make sure, if you want clear water, that you haven't got feral pigs hacking up every single catchment across the state. So there's a lot of really complex things in this, and while I have a lot of sympathy for the member for Murray's and aim in making sure that we don't get buybacks, I think we just need to address it in a much more holistic way over